Well, welcome back, everyone, to our study in the story of Jesus. And today we're going to be in our 22nd session. So we've covered quite a bit of turf, and actually, I'm kind of hoping that we will be wrapped up before Christmas. It'll be kind of strange. We'll be studying the resurrection at the same time as the nativity, but that's kind of what the plan is. Just a couple of items before we actually jump into the study. One is I want to thank all of you that have wished me a happy birthday today. So for those of you that actually are watching this on the 7th of November, it's my birthday. And let's see, the only thing I really wanted on my birthday is for all of you to have a copy of my book. So if you haven't had a chance to pick that up yet or order it from Amazon, if you'd like to give me a birthday present, that'd be a really nice birthday present. And then secondly, I wanted to remind those of you, again, if you're watching on Monday or Tuesday, make sure to get out and vote. I'm not sure that there's been a more important election in years than this one, and I'm sure all of you already have either voted or plan to. So just a couple of quick reminders there before we jump in. Today we're going to be looking at what I think is maybe one of the most significant events in the life of Jesus. Remember again that if you combine all of the Gospels together and take into account where some of the Gospels have repeat the same incident, there's roughly about 170 events that are covered in the four Gospels, and we've been trying to hit some of the highlights as we move along, and really we've been following pretty much in chronological order of the life of Christ. So just to kind of remind you, remember that really Jesus has now really entered what is sometimes called the Perean ministry, and by that it's really a reference to the fact that he has crossed over to the other side of the Jordan. That kind of began up here in Caesarea Philippi, where after the conflict that he had with the Pharisees, he took the disciples and withdrew up into this area, which was kind of a place where people would come for rest and relaxation. And so when he's on the other side of the Jordan here, eventually he's going to come down here into this area of Perea. And Luke's gospel is the primary gospel that deals with that particular area. Really the final geographical area that Jesus ministers in prior to heading into Jerusalem for Passion Week. And in between some of that, by the way, we saw that he heads down to Jerusalem, kind of crosses over to observe several of the Jewish feasts. Specifically, we saw the Feast of Tabernacles a bit, John chapter 7. Also, really, and I think it's John chapter 10, it talks about him being there for the Feast of Dedication, which is actually what we today refer to as Hanukkah, and it had to do with the rededication of the temple after, in the intertestamental period, the Seleucid ruler Antiochus Epiphanes came in, sacrificed a pig on the altar, and erected a statue to himself, defiling the temple. And when the Maccabees, this is part of the Apocrypha actually, but when the Maccabees defeated the Seleucids and cleansed the temple, the rededication took place, and we're told that they only had oil to burn the candles for one day, and yet the oil lasted for 8 days, and so that's why Hanukkah is 8 days long. And of course it would have been roughly in around our time of Christmas in December. So he's made a couple of trips to Jerusalem, and then what we're going to see here, and I'll show you the location in a minute, but in John chapter 11, we're told this. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary, and her sister Martha. He's really now come back over across the Jordan River during this period of time, which is roughly, we don't know, 3 to 6 months maybe that he's been over on this side of the Jordan. But he's been doing really, as you read the texts, he's been doing really what he's been doing all along, which he's been teaching, he's been healing, he's been telling parables, he's been casting out demons, and eventually he comes down here to this spot where we're told in John chapter 10 that he's come to where John the Baptist was baptizing, and traditionally that's been over here in this area called Bethany beyond the Jordan. And now we've been told that what we're going to be looking at today is going to take place in the town of Bethany, and so it gives you a little bit of an orientation there. Bethany, by the way, was literally just over the hill, over the Mount of Olives from Jerusalem. So if you were in Bethany and you would climb to the top of the Mount of Olives, you'd be looking out on the city of Jerusalem. So he's here across the Jordan in this region of Perea, and he gets some news, and here's what we're told. A messenger is sent to him. Lord, the one you love is sick. This is a message that we're told is sent to him by Mary and Martha. And maybe it would be a good time actually to kind of imagine that when he gets the message, maybe he reflects back on when he first met Mary, Martha, Lazarus. And if you go to the Gospel of Luke, which is the only gospel that contains this particular little piece of the story that fits in with what we're looking at in the Gospel of John, we were told this, that as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. And you might remember this story. Jesus is there in the home of Mary and Martha, and Martha is, she's really kind of the doer, has a personality that, kind of takes charge and tries to make sure everything is done just right. And you have this somewhat humorous and yet important little interaction that takes place. Again, this is prior to what we're looking at today. This is his first visit to Mary and Martha and Lazarus' home. And by the way, this is probably what a village would have looked like at this point in time. The larger building that you see there is probably the synagogue. This is a reconstruction that's been done outside modern-day Nazareth. And those kind of smaller blocks to the right of that would have been about the size of a house during that period of time. And so Martha is kind of hurrying around, and she's trying to get everything ready, and she starts to get flustered, I guess is one way of saying it. And so we're also told that Mary, by the way, in the text we're told she's the one that anointed Jesus' feet with oil and wiped it with her hair. That there might be two different incidents in the Gospels, because there's an earlier incident where he's at dinner with some Pharisees, I believe, and a woman with a kind of a shady reputation does this to him also. And I don't think that is really Mary, but in the text we're told that Mary is the one that had anointed his feet with oil. So we go on there, and Martha confronts Jesus. Again, this is still first visit. Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. What we're told in the text, of course, is that while Mary is kind of scurrying around and getting everything ready, Martha, that Mary is actually sitting at the feet of Jesus and listening to him. And so Martha gets frustrated about that and says to Jesus, tell her to help me. Now, I think perhaps that there's a little bit of a humorous expression on Jesus' face. He's getting ready to say some things to Martha, and he understands. I think he understands her personality. He understands the way she operates. He understands that she's just one of these people that is so busy she can't even take time kind of for her spiritual life, perhaps, and certainly not to stop what she's doing to listen to Jesus. So I'm thinking maybe he kind of is, shaking his head a little bit, smiling, and then he says to her, "Martha, Martha, you're worried and upset about so many things, but only one thing is needed, and Mary has chosen what is better, and it won't be taken from her." So that was the first time that Jesus was there with Mary and Martha. And it's interesting because, again, in the Luke passage, it really doesn't say anything about Lazarus. Lazarus, of course, is their brother. And yet somehow or other over time, and again, much of the life of Christ is not even recorded for us, many incidents. It's almost like that the writers, a little bit bigger scale than what we're doing, but we're picking out specific incidents to include in their Gospels. And so Lazarus isn't mentioned in the Luke passage, but by the time we get to John, he's referred to as the one that you loved. And so we'll now go back to what's just happened. He's just received word that his friend, the one that he loves, is sick. And here is, you can kind of maybe imagine him thinking through something here, because he's going to respond to this in a way that we might consider to be uncharacteristic. We're told this. For one thing, he says to his disciples that this sickness will not end up in death, and that actually that it is going to be something that will be for God's glory, and that God's Son may be glorified through it. So Jesus has a plan here. And I can remember the first time reading this, what you would anticipate at this point in time is that the disciples would pack up everything and start heading toward Bethany. But instead what we're told is that this: so when Jesus heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. Now, sometimes I've referred to this as a divine delay because there's a reason for this. Jesus has already raised 2 people from the dead, a little girl and, of course, the son of the widow of Nain. Both of those take place pretty quickly after those 2 had died, and perhaps that those that were still questioning him, maybe even those that were antagonistic toward him, could have come up with some explanation. Well, they weren't really dead. So Jesus, he didn't really bring them back from the dead because, again, their deaths were relatively recent. Well, this death is not going to be recent. This death is going to take place 4 days before Jesus arrives. And so he has this strategy, you might think of, or plan, where he doesn't do anything for 2 days. He waits because he knows that exactly how long it's going to take him to get to Bethany. To us it's kind of a strange response. I can imagine what the disciples might have been thinking, because again, in order for Jesus to do anything or to go to Lazarus, he's got to cross back out of Perea and into Judea, where they've literally just been trying to arrest him and stone him. And so the disciples perhaps are just thinking, well, we aren't going to go there because the religious leaders want to kill him. But then we read this, that after those 2 days have passed, that Jesus says to his disciples, "Let's go back to Judea." Well, now the disciples are concerned. because again, they know what had recently happened in Judea. But Rabbi, they said, a short while ago, the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back. So now the disciples are concerned about this. And so in response, Jesus says to them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep. Now, the disciples take this literally, by the way, initially, and they kind of say to him, well, if he's fallen asleep, we don't need to worry about that because, of course, he is going to wake up. But then again, Jesus, and I think perhaps in a little bit more of a sober sort of an attitude, responds to them, Lazarus is dead. So now they're going to head to Bethany, where Lazarus has been dead for several days. By the time, of course, they get there, he would have been buried and in the tomb for 4 days. One of the things that I love is I love the way that Thomas responds. And of course, Thomas is the one who, after the resurrection, won't believe it until he's actually able to, put his finger in Jesus' hands where the wounds were and in his side. And, I'm really grateful for Thomas because, again, it's such a... the information we're given there, it's like he's not just going to believe that on hearsay. He really wants to have firsthand experience, which he gets, and of course drops to his knees and now refers to Jesus at that point in time as Lord and God. But he's an interesting character because now that they know that Lazarus is dead and that Jesus is going to go there, then Thomas's response is this: let's go so that we may die with him. And I've always found that to be just a little bit humorous. This is Thomas is a guy that obviously maybe the glass isn't half empty. The glass might be all the way empty for Thomas. So anyway, they begin to head to Bethany. I'm thinking that perhaps this was a 2-day journey for them, or parts of a 2-day journey, because again, when they arrive in Bethany, they get news that Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. So John writes, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, as he approaches the village of Bethany, the first person that hears that he's on his way or that he's close by is Martha. And Martha then goes out to meet him outside of the village. We're told that Mary, at this point in time, Mary stays at home, but Martha speaks to Jesus. And what she says to him is this: Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And again, we're knowing that, he waited 2 days to even start heading there, but he had a reason for that, which again, obviously the main point of the story will reveal. But his response to her is this. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Well, Martha responds to that because as a good Jew, she believes in the resurrection of the dead at the end of the age. And so, she says to Jesus then, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. And in response to this, Jesus gives an answer that I think is, again, one of the most significant passages anywhere in the Bible, because he is going to reveal something about himself, and then he's going to do something to prove that what he has just said is actually true. So she says again, I know he'll rise in the resurrection. And Jesus' response is this in verses 25 through 26 of John chapter 11. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. This, by the way, is the next to the last time in the Gospel of John where Jesus uses this little formula that we looked at before, where in the text, I am, the two little Greek words, ego, eimi, are the equivalent in Hebrew of the name of God, Yahweh. And so this is one of those powerful statements that Jesus makes. I am the resurrection and the life. It's important, I think, that if there's a text that is used most often at weddings, it's probably it's probably the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians, the love chapter. You anticipate almost, if you go to a wedding, that text is going to be read. And I think that maybe at funerals, this might be perhaps the most frequently used passage, and maybe even the story is told. And it has to do with what happens when we die. And according to the Bible, what happens when we die depends upon our relationship with Christ. And you might remember that we've talked a little bit before, back in John chapter 3, about the two different kinds of life, that there's actually two different Greek words that are used in the New Testament. One is the Greek word psuche, which is translated life, which refers to physical life, organic life, the kind of life that all animate beings, possess. And then the second is the word zoe, which really refers to spiritual life. It's the life that God himself possesses and bestows upon a person who opens their life to Christ. And when the Holy Spirit, comes and enters into our life, then we become alive with this Zoe kind of life. And so there's two kinds of life, and there's two kinds of death, really. There's obviously physical death, but there's also spiritual death. And if you have been born twice, physically, and then born a second time spiritually, through faith in Jesus, which in this text would have to do with the fact that he says, he who believes in me will live even though he dies, you will continue to live. That real part of us, whether it's our consciousness or some state of mind, some awareness, we continue to live even after the body has died. And other texts tell us that when that happens, that we when we're absent from the body, that we're present with the Lord, that this immaterial part of our being goes to be with Jesus. And I think that's what Jesus is saying here when he said, whoever dies, he's going to live, and actually then whoever lives and believes in me will never die. You'll die physically, but you will be alive spiritually. And so this is what Jesus has just really said to Martha. And then he's getting ready to prove that what he says is true. So it's a real important text, because he is revealing something not only about life, but he's revealing something about life after death. I can remember years ago sort of hearing the little, I don't know if you'd want to call it a cliche, but the little saying that if you're born once, you die twice, that you not only die physically, but you die spiritually, which is simply separation from God and not possessing that Zoe life that God imparts when we believe in Jesus. But if you're born twice, you only die once. You die physically, but you are still alive spiritually, and actually you are in the presence of the Lord, which really gives us hope when those that we love pass away, that we know that even though physically that they have died, that because of Jesus that they still live, and that there is a day coming. And of course, resurrection, the book of Revelation, shows us that those events, but that a day is coming when that immaterial part of our being will actually be joined together with a body again, and that body will be a resurrection body. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul actually goes into quite a bit of detail of what this body will be like. Also reminds me of Jesus' encounter with Nicodemus back in John chapter 3, because again, remember that Nicodemus, who's a very, religious, righteous kind of a guy, he's a Pharisee, he's the teacher of Israel, Jesus calls him, but he says to him, unless you are born anew, again, from above, the little phrase can mean any of those three, you'll never see the kingdom of God. And that everyone needs to have this spiritual rebirth that happens when we literally open our lives to Christ and invite him to come and live in and through us. So at this point, so Jesus has had this, the first encounter with Martha. Martha leaves. Jesus is still outside the village, and she goes and gets Mary. And Mary now comes to Jesus. And when she gets to Jesus, she's quite distraught, as you can imagine. Probably one of the reasons that she initially didn't go with Martha. But she, in similar terms to what Martha's already said to Jesus, she says this: when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Now, Jesus doesn't repeat back to her the same thing that he has said to Martha. Instead, he's troubled, we're told. And, that he's kind of moved and deeply troubled. Literally, the words that are used there are the words of a horse snorting, like that is, angry or upset. And that, concept, that idea of snorting is now referred to as being moved in spirit. And he's troubled. And so he asks a question. When Jesus saw her weeping, that is Mary, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. And in response to that, he asks the question, "Where have you laid him?" And as they begin to move toward the tomb, we're told Jesus wept. I think this is a very interesting statement too. For one thing, I've been told it's the shortest verse in the Bible, so if you want to memorize any Bible verses, this would be a good one to start with. Jesus wept. But think about this, because he knows what he's getting ready to do. He is getting ready to bring Lazarus back from the dead, and yet he still weeps. I don't know completely what's going on there. I think none of us do, but we can kind of speculate. For one thing, he knows that even though he's going to bring Lazarus back to life from the dead, that another day is coming where Lazarus is going to die again. And as will every person that is there in Bethany when Jesus shows up. And so there's part of him even knowing what he is ultimately going to do at the cross, ultimately knowing that eternal life is a possibility, and yet he's weeping. And it could be simply because of the grief that he observes and the grief that he knows that's going to happen for centuries until he actually returns, when someone that we love very much dies. And even knowing these things, most of us weep also. So I just find it that he's so identified here with humanity that this situation has caused him to weep. Well, they get to the tomb, and when they get to the tomb, Jesus gives a command, and he says, "Take away the stone." Now, Martha has an interesting response to this. She doesn't know what he's getting ready to do, even though he has said, that your brother will rise again. And she hasn't quite grasped the full meaning of what he said when he said, "I'm the resurrection and the life, and whoever believes in me will live even though he dies." He now says, "Take away the stone." And Martha replies, "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been in there 4 days." I like the King James Version. Rarely do I like the King James Version better, but what she says and how it's translated into King James is actually pretty accurate to what the Greek text is. She says, "he stinketh," and of course, 4 days the body would have been in a state of disintegration, and and it really would have had a very bad odor. But Jesus has said, remove the stone, and he prays. And read the text in John chapter 11. He prays, and he basically says along the lines of, I'm praying like this so that the people here, it's to their benefit, that they hear me praying to you about this situation. And after he prays, he calls out to Lazarus. We're told in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." Now, this is another one of those moments, like what happened with the widow of Nain and her dead son, when Jesus goes to a dead body and tells the dead body to sit up. And again, it was sort of an all or nothing moment, because either that dead person was going to sit up, in which case it would have validated everything Jesus had been claiming about himself, or nothing would happen and Jesus would immediately be known as a fraud, might have been stoned right there. Well, I see this as that kind of a situation. I mean, people have come, we're told in the text, to be there with Mary and Martha and to grieve with them. And here's Jesus telling a dead man, a man that had been dead for at least 4 days, in a tomb, wrapped in grave clothes, and he has called out to him, to come forth. In other words, to become alive again and from death and come out. And the result of that, again, is that, everything hinges on this. If nothing happens, again, Jesus is going to be viewed as a fraud. And the Pharisees and the scribes and the priests would have reason, given things that Jesus had claimed, to stone him, and the story would be over, and it would be a tragedy or a farce, and you and I wouldn't be sitting here today studying this story for sure. But of course, Lazarus comes forth. And so, again, we're told this. He comes forth, he's alive, he has the grave clothes on him, which would have been like strips of linen that had been wrapped around, and then a headcloth that would have been wrapped around his head and face. And Jesus then gives the command, take off the grave clothes, let him go, unbind him, and let him go. We aren't told about the emotional response to Lazarus being alive again. We aren't really told anything that Lazarus has to say at this point, and we really aren't given any more insight into Mary and Martha. But what we are told is that the reaction of the crowd is really one of two reactions that they have. One is that we're told that many believed in him, and you would think that would be the obvious response to this. I mean, here's a man that just raised a guy from the dead, and who most of them know the entire situation. So many believed in him. The other thing that happened is that we're told that some go to Jerusalem and they tell the religious leaders in Jerusalem what's happened. And in response to that, scribes and the Pharisees call together a meeting of the Sanhedrin. And what we're told there, the bottom line is that the outcome of that meeting of the Sanhedrin is, so from that day on, they plotted to take his life. And so again, the intensity of opposition, it's at this point where if they can get their hands on Jesus, they're going to figure out a way to put him to death. And we're really, again, we're right up against kind of that final entry into Jerusalem. We have a couple of more weeks that we're going to look at a few events that take place, but one of them actually will take place as he is moving from that other side of the Jordan to Jerusalem itself. In this particular situation, we're told that when he realizes the extent of the hostility, that he takes the disciples and they leave and they head up into the wilderness a bit to a city called Ephraim, which was a small city that was about 13 miles northeast of Jerusalem. And then eventually he is going to head back over to the other side of the Jordan. And John tells us that he's actually going to make one more trip to see Lazarus and Mary and Martha. And by the way, the text a little later also tells us that this story about the resurrection of Lazarus has led so many people to believe in Jesus that they not only plot to kill Jesus, they begin to plot to kill Lazarus, because again, he's got a story that is so powerful. I was dead 4 days in the tomb, and he brought me back to life. So we have this, again, hostility beginning to reach sort of a fever pitch. So, we hit this point where we're told this: therefore Jesus no longer moved about publicly among the people of Judea. So again, he's going to cross. Instead, he withdrew to a region near the wilderness, to a village called Ephraim, where he stayed with his disciples, and then again will eventually move over to the other side of the Jordan River. So things are heating up. The time is near. Probably the next scene that we might look at, unless I really have at least one more parable I'd like to throw in here, so we'll kind of see how that goes. But again, the next scene, he's going to cross over from the Jordan back into Judea, and will head into Jericho then on his way to Jerusalem. And we have one event that we want to look at that takes place there as he heads into Jericho. So again, I think, big takeaway, is to think back on whether or not, when Jesus says, I'm the resurrection and the life, and whoever believes in me will live even though he dies. And simply remembering that, again, that if you're born twice, you're only going to die once, because you will live forever. And eventually you'll get a new body. You'll live in a perfect relationship with God forever. And it's all part of what God really has prepared for what you might think of as the next story, the bigger story, which is sometimes what we refer to as eternity. So a very important encounter in the life of Jesus, and we will we'll stop there and we'll pick up there next week. So again, thanks for being with us today, and we'll see you next week.